Welcome to Hard Talk from Chisinau, capital of Moldova, Europe's poorest country. And right now, the stage for another political and strategic tug of war between the European Union and Russia. My guest today is Moldova's Prime Minister, Iurie Lanka. His ambition is to see this country become a full member of the European Union. But there is a problem. A chunk of Moldovan territory has been in the control of pro-Russian separatists since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, maybe that sounds a little bit familiar. So how does Moldova avoid the fate of neighboring Ukraine? Prime Minister Iurie Lanka, welcome to Hard Talk. Has the crisis and the violence in Ukraine brought a real sense of vulnerability, insecurity here in Moldova?
Well, the tragic developments in Ukraine, which is just in our neighborhood, of course, are very dangerous for Ukraine, but they're very dangerous for the region and for the continent. Not just because by these violent actions, we see the entire very still fragile security architecture, which was in the process of being built, is now basically destroyed, and we need to launch the process again. But because it does raise a lot of concerns in terms of security, concerns in terms of our economic situation, because we, especially in Moldova, are a very small country and very dependent and vulnerable on the regional shocks and on the regional problems.
So you feel vulnerable today? You sound as though you feel vulnerable. What is even worse,
it brings, and it has brought and it still brings, the uncertainty. And there is nothing worse than uncertainty, because you don't know what might happen today, what might happen tomorrow, and what shall be your answers to those possible scenarios, both positive or also eventually negative.
You talk of uncertainty. Surely what has become more clear, more certain, is that Russia has the ability and certainly the intention to impose its influence and ultimately, you could argue, its authority on its neighborhood, what they call the near abroad, the old Soviet empire, if you like, and you stand as a part of that near abroad.
Well, we are not direct neighbors with Russia, but Russia to us is an important country for many, many reasons.
You're a former part of the Soviet Union.
Yes, we used to be a part of the empire.
And we know that Putin says the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he wants to reassert Russian and Moscow's authority over what used to be the Soviet empire.
What we have to understand that there are new realities, and the realities of the new world is that Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Russia are subjects of the international law and equal subjects, and that if we want to have a predictable and civilized relationship in this part of the world, and based on it to build a stable, predictable and also a prosperous region, we need to respect each other's opinions. We need to recognize, and by the way, we always acknowledge, and we do acknowledge, Russia's legitimate interests. The only problem is how you pursue those interests.
Does Russia have legitimate interests in Moldova?
Well, Russia has legitimate interests, EU has legitimate interests, US have Chinese as well, big countries. The only problem is how you pursue those interests. You can project your soft power, your attractiveness, and that's what basically EU does, that's what EU does, and that's what Russia should do in order to get this influence and to have a role in the developments.
I dare say you have thought about this very carefully, because you, more than any other Moldovan politician, have driven through this closer relationship with the European Union. In a sense, the association agreement that you've just signed and your parliament has just ratified is your baby. And you know better than anyone that Moscow regards it as highly provocative.
Well, this stance of Moscow on the association agreement, and especially on the part which is related to the trade arrangements, is a bit new, because we came to power in 2009 in September. And from the very first day since we came to power, we pursued exactly the same rhetoric, the same objectives, whether we were in Moscow or in Chisinau or in Brussels. So it was not a secret to anyone, and that's why this reaction is a bit strange to us. That's number one. Number two, we respect the opinion of our immediate neighbors, and we have two neighbors of our other partners, and Russia, as I mentioned, is among the important partners. But what is most important for me as a politician, for Moldovan society, is to choose our path. And from my understanding, my analysis, and our judgment here is that there is no alternative to us if we want to build a normal European and to some extent hopefully boring society. And for this we need to bring in here values which prove to be extremely efficient in the new members of the European Union, Baltic countries, Romania, Hungary or Poland. We need to apply the same standards, we need to apply the same rules. And then I'm sure Moldova will become a functioning state. There are no alternatives.
Well, that is your hope, and I sense the passion with which you deliver those words. But you must have heard the Deputy Russian Prime Minister, Dmitry Rogozin, say just the other day, this association with the European Union means Moldova is fundamentally changing its neutral status. And as far as Russia is concerned, that is not acceptable.
Well, Dmitry Rogozin used to say many things, and one problem which I have is that usually he communicates with us via Twitter and Facebook account, and I would prefer, and I always prefer, to have a direct communication, a dialogue, and exchange of views and arguments. As you know it very well, there are members of the European Union which are neutral countries or countries outside the military blocs: Austria, Sweden, Finland. So by becoming a member of the European Union, and we still have a long way until we become full-fledged members of the European Union, it doesn't mean that we need to change our status as a neutral country. Again, it has nothing to do with it. It is just simply a wrong and distorted approach on what neutrality means and what membership, future membership.
Why do you think the Russians are playing this game then, if you think it is a game?
Well, it's difficult to understand. In our dialogue with officials in Moscow, foreign ministry in first place, because they are to represent the country's official position, they know it very well that accession to the EU has nothing to do with the changing of neutrality. As to the neutrality, I do believe for my country it is still an asset. We just need to prove, and here Russian colleagues should and could help us to prove that it's not a liability, but it's a real asset which could bring more stability and more predictability, more security to our country. That's on what I would like Mr. Rogozin to focus, because if he's a big fan of our neutrality, he should help us to get rid of the former 14th Russian army from the Transnistrian region.
Well, I'm glad you introduced the subject of Transnistria, because it fascinates me that we talk about Russia, and we should, for our audience, explain that you were trained in Moscow during the time of the Soviet Union as a diplomat. You even served for a short time as a Soviet diplomat before the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know Moscow's mindset very well, and you know how much Moscow still sees the situation in Transnistria, where there is a small population which has broken away from your state, even though it's on your territory, and which looks to Moscow for its future. You know that that gives Moscow enormous leverage inside your country.
Well, it is true. I was trained as a future Soviet diplomat back in the 80s, and I am very proud and very grateful to those who taught me in Moscow.
And may I interrupt and say, you know, therefore, that the fact there are nearly 2,000 Russian troops permanently stationed on your soil inside Transnistria is something which gives Russia a huge stake in the future of Transnistria and Moldova.
Well, it's not just through this military presence that Russia has an important leverage over the developments, and that's why Russia was, is, and will be a very important partner in our joint efforts, together with the Ukrainians, together with the EU and US and the OSCE, to find a solution, a political solution. No one, again, neglects or ignores or underestimates Russia's influence, but also role in the region. My only request was always to my Russian colleagues and friends that, again, by acknowledging their interest, let's change a bit the way they pursue it. I know that after 23 years since the former Soviet Union was broken, it's still a painful process until we learn that there are new realities. And I understand that sometimes it's not a rational approach, but mostly emotions, which unfortunately are the basis for certain decisions.
You must realize that if your relations with Moscow continue to deteriorate, there is a very real possibility that Russian military intervention could happen in Transnistria just as it did in Crimea, and you would be powerless to stop it. You know that.
In the Transnistrian region, which is beyond our control, you are right, nothing happened to the extent that the situation would become outside of anyone's control. I appreciated that they didn't take unilateral decisions. I appreciate and I know that our colleagues from Moscow did exercise a kind of stabilizing effect on those in Transnistria, and that's what I can hope also for the future.
But it's very fragile. It is very fragile.
Well, it is fragile, but again, there is a mechanism. There is this 5+2 talks, and again, I hope that no one is interested in a new source of tension.
Well, I'll tell you what.
We have enough it already in Ukraine.
Mr. Rogozin, whom we've already mentioned, the Deputy Prime Minister in Russia, who's responsible for Transnistria in Russia, he made a point of going to their Transnistrian Victory Day celebrations just a couple of months back in May. And while he was there, he said to the Transnistrians, "We will do everything necessary to act as the guarantors of your security." It was quite clearly a threat to you.
Well, I'm not saying that we ignore or neglect what Mr. Rogozin says, and unfortunately sometimes his statements are even offensive, not to say that they are not very constructive. But we are trying to do our best, in first place, not to give any reasons to our Russian colleagues somehow to take a line which might lead to a worsening of the relationship. That's not our interest. We want to keep a very active political dialogue. We want our trade to develop, and we do believe that the European integration makes us more predictable, makes us more stable and more reliable interlocutor, which serves not just the interests of our society and our relation with the West, but also our relation with the East.
I can see that that might work as long as you are in power, because you are determined to push forward with this policy. But there are elections coming in Moldova in November, and the main opposition party and its allies, the communists, they are absolutely opposed to your association agreement, and they want actually to join the Russian-backed customs union and be much closer to Moscow. Now, your predecessor as Prime Minister, Vladimir Filat, he said just the other day, Russia has increased its intelligence activity inside Moldova, in political parties, in NGOs, in the media, and they have only one objective: to destabilize the government in the run-up to November's elections. Do you agree with him?
So far, I have no big evidence of this direct activities, subversive nature of it. Yes, we have NGOs which are sponsored from Moscow, and it's not against our legislation. But our key problem, again, we can always say that Moscow is meddling, Moscow is irresponsible, Moscow's hand, so to say, is in charge, and just to look for forgiveness for our kind of impotence. But that's not exactly what I think we should do. There are things which depend on us, and there are things which do not depend on us. So what happens in the region, unfortunately, is beyond our control. But there are things and issues and weaknesses in our society which are our direct responsibility. For example, we need to have much more sustainable institutions. Isn't it our task? Can Moscow somehow impede us? No. It is our responsibility, and we need to make our institutions much stronger. Corruption. Is it Moscow responsible that we still have a striving corruption in this country? No, it's our responsibility, it's our guilt also, and we need to do much more.
Right. Let us now